Kapsiset Kakiokiwapatin Utiaski Notekimiwan Kutak Okisigaw Akami mo kawititin Itos kutsita Namoya kosta Towin Ita mitsitsi Makikwe matuin Kaya kustatsi Kutak ukisigaw
Masina ikan kaki no apat naman 1740s, 1760s. Utstau isa egisiniga asut kitsansin ni no ugemau. Kanaga tsisi tansin no, kuasagi kiskangi tage setaisi matsi isut. Kuasa kusisi kami no to tansin no, utstau ugemau isa egisiniga atit kitsansin ni no. Atimes tasagi atimes kutsipan expik kati tipeni tago te meswe moniao. Expik kati tipeni meguago samis tai naspitsi ugebagan ke atisiniga tigai no.
Kudrida danak oldare ettuanda yille hanike tutut enandant onate kont onate hadoril inike.
Ego spiego bagagi punnotun tokigone naspitsi ego si siansin no kiat nagati so meswechegi si wapata agamaskik papituste egi pamituta te pamintuta maget. Igone kai kagi pegia utte ut. Ego sisi naspitsi kiatti maames kutsipanuge van.
Kudri 1918 tlats algaldana hut o the Mohawk Indian Lieutenant Frederick Lowell the Neatheltinike King of England hell aye dana dant ono sak aya dana stodanet ile December 20, 1918 anin chao aye dana halko dinike dant utana vits etiha aye dant utana stodanet ile kanaltha Canada aya kont.
A lot of that movement to allow First Nation students to get into the mainstream school system, to get out of the residential school system, which was horrific, came from the returning soldiers, both the World War I and World War II. My grandfather was in both wars. And so when they went overseas and they got to travel outside the reserve, they saw the way the rest of the world was. And they saw the freedoms and rights that other Canadians had and other people around the world had. And so they were able to study their own situation in a broader comparative context and see how terribly they were being treated, how marginalized they were, and how discriminated against they were, how little access they had to education and employment opportunities and things like that. So they started to lobby for changes in the Indian Act.
Kudri 1930 aye tlats algaldana hut o danenin telo Edriasit a eddoneha yannadats anawalye danidanik enotsak aya.
The Indian Act was a really oppressive piece of legislation. You know, it had prohibited a lot of our ceremonies. It had the compulsory residential school attendance thing. It imposed the chief and council system on us, and even your chief and council had to be approved by the Indian agent.
Kod 1944 pers ertlis seneketri tanets anbayaz ertlis konateha 1947 oi bill pass alyanik etri tanets anbayaz school nateha to aziz to danet ina.
Indians weren't allowed to go to public schools until around 1948. They were denied access because schools fell under provincial jurisdiction. which is why most of them in that era only got a grade 8 education that they were able to get at residential school or at the few remaining day schools.
Tapo ko mga na ego siya ni mga pitikata 1951. Ego ta Indian Act ko tagusita.
Indian Affairs up to that point only concerned itself with grade 1 to 8 and then eventually to grade 12. And it didn't even develop any grade 12 programming per se. They just developed transfer agreements to the provinces to allow Indian students to go into provincial schools.
Et papi kiskota tsika utagagi pitigat peer true. Yung ani peer true ga pitigat mistake chiga ita mag 1968 an sinya ka gusis. Pete ko esta isia pinagani an kita.
Kuto dre tanes an bayaza tot enek isinate ha kont o hatana yorel e.
Ego spiko tini na first get tia au na peo Jean Chrétien kita. Itai sa po kaya itsa yung utaga puna kistan was prime minister. Ego spiko ni ma kakipitigat siya teka ni ma white paper 1969. Kikusko yun egoisko ni ganin no. Ewaut negate ni gutas kaya ya isko ni ganin no.
There's a 1969 on edero edere tanestan bayaza tiya kanate chan edere schools a konate ha ayero edene ho azi donesnya jan ja Canada kaya. The tanestan bayaza tanadre white paper policy kanana tenike the liberal government edi eya donesna ho edere edene is red paper policy.
So our grandfather explained to us when we were young what the treaty negotiations were all about and what the ideas were and the agreements were concerning education. And it was when the old people and the leaders went into negotiations for the treaty, their position was that we weren't giving up our traditional education systems, that we would hang on to that. And there was no discussion at treaty negotiations that our education system would be taken away from us at all. So what they negotiated for was that we would hang on to our system, but we would also have access to the cunning of the white man, and that the federal government, the Dominion government at that time, agreed to provide education to all First Nations people, equivalent to any education available to Canadians. Up until about the mid-70s, the education First Nations people received was the education package that the federal government and even some of the churches still provided. And so the quality of education wasn't great. And First Nations across Canada were saying that we can do this ourselves. And so the big Indian control of Indian education movement started afoot in the late 60s, early 70s, and culminated in a position paper called Indian Control of Indian Education that was presented to Ottawa in the early 70s.
Kuto dre edere tanestan bayaza yehen chone gedere school ay yalti dana hodon altane ay betalya public school ay sa kohodon altanal yanig Kuto dre tanestan bayaza dre 1969 ay yehen chuho edere sa kod abiyati altelo yon hodon altana na janig
when you go to residential school, you just drop your language. I mean, you had a lot of help dropping your language. And I think it would be very good if we, at different areas like the Indian education and so on, there should be other components besides what we can learn from the white person teaching us, from there.
Tanis anbayas drit abayati altele altnadits anaretelo bananak dribeyatia danayalti ha konto hodone hadayanal taniha.
When you go to residential school, you have that break from your own family. Well, maybe up to sometimes for 13 years, you don't interact with your family, and you leave home. And all through those years, a lot of us missed our adolescent years because we were spent in the residential schools. So we didn't know how to live in between there.
1972 in Stam, Kagusika Tikumuta, Saskatchewan Indian Culture Center. Eguaya Yagoba Moatsum Stamoma, the first one Nathan. Ekosika Tika is an institute at the provincial level that serves First Nations. Ekome Komum near Motnika and Ekosika Ukmahan, Ekosita. I go to Gomaya here, and I got to hear him. Gomena Pusita, go with the task, go with the Tasumaga, in an area language, big school.
Pegan apita ko sana. Apita ko sana kagut kiao pegna peo 1969 the outsiders kitsaga tewanama 180 make igapu mamitrene mi tapita ko sana ko sis.
Kudir tanis anbayas dana the Saskatchewan Kayouts in 1960 at the Métis Society Hulyalyanik e. Ayot in 1982 only the Rotary Tanis Anbayas dana a government's an the Constitution Act a Mindianik e. A Roto Aboriginal people Dolia Jaho at the Nebets a board of the Métis National Council 1983 a Dayatsin a Métis Nation ha.
The political relations between the Métis Society and the province of Saskatchewan were quite strained because for a number of reasons. There was a number of social, economic issues that we had put before government, and it didn't seem that they were listening. And it was brought to our attention at one point that the Prime Minister of Canada would be meeting with all of the premiers in Waskesiu. So we blockaded the roads into Waskesiu. There was approximately 500 people that showed up, and shortly thereafter, the province of Saskatchewan agreed to sit down with the Métis Society of Saskatchewan.
It's all court government dayral the anbayas dana the education chugatala now the social issues ha. Kudur in 1970 the Quantanis anbayas the school hichu ha 19
Government well, you can pay our own school. We wanted our own board to be in place. And that's where the Matsinotin to act out. It was the church versus the Métis Society of Saskatchewan, I guess you would say at that time. And the fight was on. I think the power base was starting to shift more to the community, going away from like Smagansak, Ugimawak, Dakter, Wayos.
We wow okay. Egunigo ke kakip na niganista ke kumaksknamasuan.
Ekte ba matsnotin toto. Yo apata ko that yo anista to their grip on people. They were one, they were all not to hit it the way.
Kudred dana Cons and that education they'll show take a 19 is Dene he'll show her.
Now, Indian Affairs has always taken a position that they don't acknowledge university as a treaty right. Indian Affairs has always taken a position that, and their position is based on a literal interpretation of the treaties, that their treaty obligation is only to provide elementary school education, all that which would have been available in a little schoolhouse in the country. Their position is they weren't responsible for post-secondary. And of course that's totally the opposite of what a lot of our oral historians tell us about our treaty rights to education.
Kudrit or young as schools at Lagatala as the Ordono Yatin Anarelha.
Kiskinwahama yakoma nido yunigani da macho and Kiskinwahama tegamugo. We don't chit up a go with Tamina the Situskas, Chagawas, Kispin with Machitana, no neither big school and Mina, neither Machihuin, Nanto, Nisap, Kawichat Skimago, that the ski of Migwatch, Yatuskata, Kiskinwahama the snake and the Mitsaho, Kiskinwahama York, that Toski when I was Sagi money who to check. This neither in a gamuchek, the nanny hidois check. The tournament was sagat the tamok in hidawchek, comina, nanny hidois check, the comino negi guava, medidit tamitoa.
I've never had one Aboriginal teacher, as old as I am, you know, took lectures and all that teachers were and they never put themselves up to learn our language. So we had to learn theirs.
Kudri tenets and bayas the no sakaya the oral days a banana. No need dana, no is a codonil tanhadoril.
People had entering into universities in the 70s was that they weren't adequately prepared. The on-reserve education they received was of pretty low quality, and so they were having a really difficult time in the university system. Also, there wasn't a whole lot of First Nations graduates out of high school back then. So that's when the TEP programs emerged.
Well, ITEP actually, we like to think of it as a result of the 1969 Indian control of education. We were probably the first program in Canada to take on the challenge of developing and implementing a First Nations teacher education program. Enrollment escalated from 21 students to over 186. Our numbers right now average approximately 185, 200 students per year.
So at the same time where you've got First Nations communities taking over funding programs, you've got Indian Affairs capping the money. See, so there's a couple of things happening here. Just as the numbers start to increase, Indian Affairs caps the money. And as soon as First Nations start taking control over administering their own programs, Indian Affairs caps the money.
An idea was formed in 1976 at an Amnesis educational conference. A group of Métis and non-status people got together and felt it was necessary to create a Métis-specific institution. And part of the thinking of the day was there was a recognition at the time that mainstream institutions were not meeting the needs of First Nations and Métis peoples. This was evident if we look at many of the socio-economic indicators of the time. Métis people at that time felt that if we had a Métis-specific organization and it was Métis-controlled and constituted with our values and culture, that we could improve those numbers and we could more equitably participate in the Canadian and Saskatchewan economies by preparing our people for jobs and allowing them to earn an income for their family.
Kutu in 1976 known in the Rotary Suntep program at Dene.
Within our Suntep program, we would have 180 students per year, and typically we would have a graduating class of around 15 to 20. Throughout its history, Suntep has graduated over 700 students, which is a very powerful number when one starts to think about it.
Could the Northern Saskatchewan, the Northern Teacher Education Program, NORTEP, Donald Tansa?
Gipoyan ITEP in 1980. Kawed gipitohtan Suntep iponihtayan ma the Bachelor of Education degree. Pekuta namatix nama gano ta NORTEP. Kagiopigyan makapix nama soyan namagigwe nihio snamagiwak nigiwap mawak egotsin ya kagigawat tamanoma the taksnamagian.
And it's interesting that the earliest university graduates were educators. They came out of education faculties, they came out of social work faculties, or they came out of the ministry.
So more and more we're gaining control over our own lives. We have a long way to go yet, but you know, it's changed, you know, substantially. I can remember in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, when there were meetings, you know, the white people, the conservation officers, other people in authority would go to the front and they would run our meetings, and our people really were more subservient. Although they didn't like maybe the way things were happening, they weren't overly vocal, but so the Métis people basically have achieved that sense of, I guess, decolonization, if you can call it that. So it is a massive change.
Well, First Nations University of Canada was, as you know, it was called Saskatchewan Indian Federated College back in 1976 when it started. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations had seen the need for First Nation university graduates and saw that very few people were getting through the other universities, and so they had for several years really tried to find a partner that would work with them to develop a First Nations university.
Kudri at Holtsi Handa Ida was a case all the SIFC Hilsine. Could the home Bezir Nant on her in Charjaho FSIN Holy at the Canada Gaya at the Holy.
Weski Tigaski Tao Skoniganin no Utauchi Saskatchewan Kaitigate. Mistake Soganeta Ganita negotiation. Utstau Kitchansin negotiation mamma. Kaskitao tasugigapay stagere. Umotagagin opata mag Kiskinwahama Towin. Utstapu kaya te egipap mamitrengi tamigot kitchansin nino. Anuchi opatera no Sapohtew kichigaskita wago Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations kai tichi kawitatos kay ma chigwi chansin nino. Kaskita ge Sapohtew chiguma kaya teochi tipama Towin treaty rights kai chigate egutauchi and
it's only been in the past 20 years, really, that you've got a new generation that's expanding beyond education, social work, and the ministry. So in the past 20 years, you've got this wonderful diversity of First Nations graduates from engineering, from medicine, from dentistry, from history, from anthropology, archaeology, economics. And you've only seen that phenomenon recently. It's a really new phenomenon, so that many of the people of my generation, for example, were the first Indians to graduate in their graduate programs. First Nations people and education is still a really fresh new history.
Mr. Hey, Kiskinwahama, wapake kawapatino, wahyo ipimutia. Kutak ukisigaw, ni once, ni matihon.